I will never know exactly when these videos are over, and it's okay for me to stop talking or start talking. Something that cracked me up earlier, before Levi and Betsy came up, when Katie started, this is not part of the sermon, but when Katie started doing the announcements, her first announcement was, we're not having a class this month, which I would love it if all of our announcements were just things we're not doing. So let me tell you what we're not doing. We're not having a Christmas party this week. So I'm gonna lobby for that. From now on, all announcements are just things like in the negative, just things we're not doing. For things we are doing, you can check the app, but here's all the stuff that we're not doing. Anyway, neither here nor there, just things I think about before I come up to preach. So we are finishing this series that we started a few weeks ago, and before the service, Katie asked me, "Are we finally going to be done with this series?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "We could be done now." So so we're going to go ahead and finish it. And we had planned to go longer, but Katie wanted it to be over. So we're just gonna go ahead and wrap it up today. So we're finishing the series on basically the life and perspective of this guy named Peter that we find in the scriptures. And so the backstory on Peter, as we've seen if you've been with us, is Peter is one of Jesus's original disciples. And a lot of times what we have is we have stories about the disciples that tend to sort of center around Peter. And so the question becomes, is Peter just the guy who constantly is talking when everybody else isn't? Or are these writers using Peter as kind of a stand-in for how everybody else is thinking and feeling at the time as well? And so one of the things that we've seen over and over again is Peter does sort of represent the larger group. Peter does represent a larger perspective that we've seen over and over as we've looked at these stories. And one of the things that we find that Peter expects, that probably many of the other disciples also expected, was that by following Jesus, they were joining a movement that would ultimately result in the overthrowing of the Roman Empire, at least as it pertains to the Judean region, and getting the Romans out of this area and beginning to take over and being able to rule themselves. And we see over and over again, Peter clearly expects this. Peter clearly expects some sort of violent uprising, some sort of revolution, all the way down to the moment when Jesus is arrested. Peter's move is not to run and hide. Peter pulls out a sword and starts swinging. And Jesus' words to him are, "Put away your sword, for anyone who draws the sword will surely die by the sword." And so Jesus clearly has a different set of expectations than Peter does. And we saw it again last week or 2 weeks ago, when you see how when Peter says, "No, you're not going to be arrested and die. We're going to lead this revolution." Jesus calls Peter Satan and says, "No, you're in the way. You're actually slowing down the progress that we're trying to make here." And so constantly we see Jesus's expectations for his own path diverging with Peter's and them coming into conflict. And so what we saw last week is Peter finally having this realization of, when Jesus talked about self-sacrifice and surrender, he wasn't kidding around. He actually was serious. And so Jesus allows himself to be arrested, which leads to Peter's dark night of the soul, which ultimately results in Peter's denying Jesus. And we talked last week about how Peter denying Jesus wasn't I'm really afraid of being arrested, so I'm just going to pretend like I never met the guy. Peter's denying Jesus, very likely, I would argue, is Peter saying, "I thought I knew what I was participating in, but it turned out I was wrong. I thought I understood what we were doing, but it turned out I didn't." And so a lot of Peter's mental space has to kind of be reconfigured in terms of what are we doing here? So fast forward, we're going to, as we wrap this up today, we're going to look at, okay, what happens now? Because now we have a post-resurrection world. So in the span of time of Peter's denial, we have, from that point to the point we're going to be looking at, the tomb has been discovered to be empty. Jesus has resurrected. And so now we have this group of people living in a post-resurrection reality. So the question becomes, how do people now view the story that they're a part of? So Jesus is executed by the Roman Empire, resurrected 3 days later. There's a new reality. There is a post-resurrection reality. And we're going to step into the story right as the tomb is discovered to be empty. So in John chapter 20, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved," which, by the way, in the first century, a lot of times if you were writing an account of an experience that you had been a part of, you would not talk about yourself by name in the third person, and you would probably not write in the first person either. You would give yourself some sort of indicator, some sort of descriptive term to help the reader understand that you're talking about yourself. And John, of all the different things that John could have chosen for himself, he decides he's going to start calling himself the disciple that Jesus loved. So already, like, John's self-esteem is okay. Like, he's doing fine. So he says, so she, Mary, came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, and said, they have, as if to imply that Jesus didn't love the other ones. Whatever, John. So it says, not to throw shade at one of the gospel writers, but hey. So it says, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. So the body has gone missing. What do we do now? And so now the question, because they now have to see this for themselves, John and Peter are going to go and witness this for themselves and see what's going on. And so in verse 3, it says, so Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first, because that's the most important detail of this story. Because when you have a time-changing, like earth-shaking, reality will never be the same again, the real question is, but who ran faster to figure it out? So John needs you to know, the tomb is empty. Of course, the world has changed, but also I'm a pretty fast runner. So the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him, assuming John is, like, the subtext of this is out of breath and winded because he's much older and slower than I am. So Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloths that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, just in case you forgot, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So John is setting up the story. He's telling you the story. He needs you to know that he is a little bit better than Peter in a couple of ways. And one of those ways is he is a faster runner, and he starts to believe earlier. Notice that detail too. He talks about how John saw and believed. So there is some sort of weird tension and rivalry between John and Peter. However, there's also this dimension of all the other three gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the last word that they have it to say about Peter is Peter's denial, which we looked at last week. At least John comes back around and says, by the way, more stuff happened with Peter after that. The other guys did not want to talk about it, but we'll go ahead and mention that here. So at least John sort of gives Peter a fuller character arc than the other three do. So there is some sort of weird tension between John and Peter in the midst of this. John clearly sees that there is some sort of competition, and clearly this goes both ways. So, which we're about to see. So, the question now becomes, learning that we now live in a post-resurrection world, and now trying to figure out what exactly does it look like for us to continue to participate in the story that Jesus is telling. What do we do now? So later on in John chapter 21, the disciples are with Jesus and they are having a meal. And so the question now becomes, there's a big elephant in the room, because the last thing that anybody heard about Peter was him denying that he knew Jesus. So now, what do we do about this? Are we going to not talk about it because it's awkward, or are we going to go ahead and address it? Jesus, of course, decides to address it. So in verse 15, John chapter 21, it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Verse 16, again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Then in verse 17, the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? At which point we would, as 21st century English-speaking readers, we would think, okay, Jesus is having memory problems. This is a Finding Dory situation, and we need to work our way through it, because he keeps asking the same question over and over again when clearly Peter has answered the question. The reason John is recording this, or the reason Jesus is asking this 3 times, this is meant to mirror the denial scene in which Peter denies Jesus 3 times. So the point that John is trying to make here is not Jesus doesn't remember the conversation he just had. The point of this is Jesus is trying to sort of remind Peter of the story that he's in, and he's trying to give the reader a sense that we're starting this thing over. We are closing the loop on the denial scene. So it says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. In other words, could we please just drop this? And so then it says, Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you were old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. So the whole thing that Jesus is inviting Peter into, basically he's saying, like, look, I know we've had a hard time communicating in terms of like what the expectations were and what we're doing on this journey. Hopefully now that you've seen me allow myself to be arrested and allow myself to be killed and resurrected from the dead, hopefully at this point you understand the kind of story that we're actually participating in. And what Jesus is saying to Peter here is, I would love it if you could be a part of that story. I would love it if you could follow along and actually help build this thing that will bring more grace and peace and joy and love into the world. My hope here, Peter, is that you will participate in the story that I'm leading us through. And so that's the whole feed my sheep thing. That is what Jesus is saying. You are invited to participate in this thing. We can get past all of the tension, all of the struggle, all of the miscommunication. We're closing the loop on the denial scene, and now we can just move forward. So Jesus is giving Peter this beautiful opportunity to try again. And so then in verse 20, right after this. So I would imagine if you're Peter, you would have lots of questions. What do we do next? What does it look like for me to do this? How do we move forward now that we're all on the same page? That's not Peter's first question. Peter's first question in verse 20, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved, was following them. You know how you want to hear what people are saying, so you follow and listen to their conversation. And John's like, what? I'm going to write a book about this one day. I'd like to know what you said. So Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is going to betray you? John is desperate for you to know like how tight he and Jesus have always been. So Peter looks back at John, and in verse 21, it says, when Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus reinstates Peter. Jesus pulls him into the story and says, look, we're going to try this again. We are going to begin telling the story, and you are going to be a critical part of the story. Peter's first question out of the gate is, what about that guy? What's he going to do? Look at Jesus' answer is in verse 22. Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that the disciple would not die, but Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? In other words, why is that your journey has nothing to do with what this other guy is going to do or not do on his journey. So Peter's first question, what about him? And Jesus' answer, what is that to you? You follow me. Jesus' answer is, you are already, just by asking that question, you're already spending way too much time concerned about somebody else's journey and not your own. Peter cannot focus on his own role in the story because all he wants to know is, yeah, but what about that guy? And Jesus' response is, what is that to you? Your job isn't to worry about the role that John or any of these other guys are going to play in the story. Your job is to follow your own path. What is that to you? You follow me. Jesus does not think it's worth anybody's time to spend lots and lots of energy worrying about how somebody else is going to follow their path. Jesus' interest is, yeah, but how are you going to follow your path? Peter has a calling. He has a role to play. He has his own specific ways that he is expected to bring light and goodness into the world. But his first question is, okay, but what about that guy? What kind of path is he going to be on? Will he be more important than I will be? Will he suffer more or less than I will? Will he get more attention than I will? Will he struggle more or less than I will? Peter has all sorts of concerns about what somebody else is going to do. And Jesus doesn't want to talk about it. Jesus' only interest is, what is that to you? You follow me. This conversation is not about him. This is about you. You follow me. This story raises lots of questions, I think, for each of us, because it raises the question of how often do we get distracted by comparing ourselves to other people and get sidetracked from our own specific path and calling because we're so wrapped up in our own minds on, well, yeah, but what about them? Why aren't they having to follow? Why does their struggle look so much easier than mine does? Why are they having such an easier time than I am? Why are they getting more attention, more recognition, more praise than I am for following their path than I get for following my path? And Jesus says, what is that to you? You follow me. You have a path. How often do we get distracted by what other people are supposed to be doing that we miss out on our own unique callings? So this is not new, by the way. We see this all over the scriptures. All over the scriptures, we find people who are struggling to embrace and accept their own story and their own identity. So we have this story in Genesis chapter 27, and we alluded to this story a little bit last week. We're going to revisit a little bit of it that we talked about last week. It's about a guy named Jacob. And Jacob is a twin, but Jacob is the second-born twin. And in the ancient Near East, that actually mattered a lot because in the ancient Near East, there was this notion that the firstborn son got all of the privileges, the blessings, the legacy of the family name, all of that belonged to the firstborn son. And even if you were a twin, if you were the second-born twin, you were still not considered as important as the firstborn son. And so that's where Jacob is. Jacob has a twin brother named Esau, who's like a few seconds or like older than he is, but that's all that matters. So Esau is older, which means he's entitled to certain privileges and certain blessings that Jacob isn't going to get. So at a certain point in Genesis chapter 27, Jacob, with the help of his mom, who babies him, Jacob and his mother come up with a plan to trick their Jacob's blind father. You know how you trick people when they're blind and you're trying to get something from them and you're trying to like pretend like you're somebody else. We've all been there. So it's... So Jacob is trying to trick his blind father Isaac into believing that he's his older brother Esau, so that he can get a blessing that is meant for Esau. To which we would be like, "That's stupid. Like, why? Like, if it's a blessing, it's just a spoken like series of words. What does it matter what he says or who he says it to? It's just words." That's not how people saw it in the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, the belief was if someone gives you a blessing, if a father gives a blessing to a child, it wasn't just like a nice word, like something you write inside of a greeting card. This is, you are speaking reality into existence. And so the assumption is when a father blesses a son, that father is creating a new reality. And you cannot uncreate something once it's been created. So when a father would give their son a blessing, like a birthright-oriented blessing, the belief was that father is creating reality for their son. So Jacob decides he wants the blessing that is meant for his brother Esau, but he knows his dad's not going to give it to him because he's not the actual firstborn son. So what they decide to do is he decides to go in and trick his blind father into believing that he is the older son, that he is his twin brother Esau. So in verse 18, it says in Genesis 27, it says, he, Jacob, went to his father and said, "My father." "Yes, my son," he answered. "Who is it?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing." And then in verse 24, it says, "Are you really my son Esau?" He asked, "I am," he replied. So Jacob goes in and fully lies to his dad about who he is. He is putting on a false persona in order to receive something that does not belong to him. And he gets it. And as a result, it creates a massive divide between him and Esau. Esau spends a lot of years trying to find Jacob so he can kill him. And so there is a wedge driven between these two brothers that cannot fully be repaired as a result of this moment, because Jacob can't just walk his own path. He needs to get what Esau is supposed to get as well. How many of us, a big part of our story is we feel like we are constantly being compared to somebody else, that we are constantly reaching for a thing that is that it belongs to somebody else's journey. And so that's where Jacob is. And as a result, Jacob commits identity theft, basically. He pretends to be his brother so that he can get something that belongs to his brother. So as a result, he spends years having to flee and run from his brother who's trying to kill him. And then eventually in Genesis 32, we have this scene, which we looked at last week, in which Jacob wrestles with a stranger who is meant to represent some sort of divine figure, like God or some representative of God. And so in Genesis chapter 32, Jacob is wrestling. We looked at this last week, and Jacob, they're coming to the end of their struggle. And then verse 26, it says, "Then the man said, 'Let me go, for it is daybreak.' But Jacob replied, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' The man asked him, 'What is your name?'" Which, by the way, for Jacob is a loaded question, right? Because Jacob is already, in the story, has already been asked his name, and what name did he give? Esau. Earlier in the story, when Jacob is asked what his name is, he says the wrong name. He pretends to be somebody else. So now in the story, as Jacob wrestles and struggles with the divine, he is asked the question, what is your name? The reader understands, the writer understands, like, oh, this is not just like a, hey, by the way, what is your name? I need this information. This is a loaded question because you're asking somebody who up to this point has struggled to answer honestly when asked, what is your name? Jacob has struggled to find his own place in the story, so much so that he has pretended to be somebody else. So this encounter has a divine figure asking Jacob, hey, what is your name? The writer is telling us we are revisiting a critical moment in Jacob's history. So in the next sentence, it says, Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, you will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome, which is great. Like all this time, Jacob has struggled to answer with his own name. What is your name? He's given the wrong answer. Here, Jacob gives the correct answer, and the first thing that happens is the person's like, okay, well, that's not your name anymore. So now that you know your name, we're going to change your name. So, and which, of course, the name, Israel, we talked about last week, means struggles with God. The whole thing is about wrestling and struggling and trying to find your place in the story. And so Jacob is ready to be on his own path. This is a huge moment in the arc of this character. Jacob is ready to finally be Jacob, which means he's ready to grow. He's ready to evolve. He's ready to come to a point of like, okay, I don't have to stay here. I can move forward. There is this forward motion that comes along with being able to say your own name and identify your own path. Maybe what happens with us is we aren't okay with who we are. We struggle to say our own name. We aren't comfortable with, or we aren't okay with how our lives have turned out. Maybe there's some kind of deficiency that we feel makes us less than who we are. Maybe this is one of the central struggles of what it means to be human, to try and when asked, who are you, to truthfully answer, this is who I am. This is the path that I'm on. How many of us, we struggle so much with the need to look like or to be somebody else or to travel somebody else's path. And this whole story is oriented around maybe your journey starts when you learn to say your own name and you learn to identify your own path. How can I be at peace with myself or with others when I constantly wish I was somebody else or on somebody else's path? Over and over and over again, we have stories of people who struggle to find their own path because they are so wrapped up in comparing their journey with the journeys of other people. So, which brings us back to Peter. Jesus says, I'm inviting you to be a part of this. I'm inviting you to help me change the world. And Peter says, yeah, but what about that guy? And how often do we lose our joy because all we can think about is how somebody else is doing or the accomplishments that somebody else has done or the opportunities that somebody else has received. Over and over and over again, we find the question, yeah, but what about that guy? And Jesus' answer is, what is that to you? Your job is to follow me. Your job is to travel your path. Asking what about that guy doesn't get you any farther. It doesn't move the story forward. All it does is slow you down and add frustration and a lack of joy to the whole situation. Jesus isn't just saying, hey, focus. Jesus is saying, listen, you will never get anywhere by spending all your energy trying to figure out what about that guy. Over and over and over again, we have these stories, and over and over again, the writers of the scriptures continue to remind us, no, your job is to be on your path. So, and this manifests in a few ways. One way that we see this sort of impulse of like, yeah, but what about that guy? One of the ways we see it happen is in things like envy and resentment. Like we look around and we notice that certain people have things that we wish we had, or that certain people have it easier than we wish we had it. And so we find that we are in a place of comparison, and that makes it very difficult to find any kind of joy or contentment or to travel our own path. In fact, again, very old concept. In the book of Exodus, there is a very famous passage or series of passages called the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And I would imagine most of us are familiar, at least as a concept, of the Ten Commandments. And so we have these 10 commandments. We have these 10 things that are laid out for this group of people, which are mostly pretty like measurable, like don't murder and don't steal. Like, you know what I mean? Like there are things, or even like observe the Sabbath. Like you can measure whether or not a person is doing these things, basically, depending on how you define those actions. And so, but they're external observable things. But then the 10th commandment is an outlier against the other 9 because it's harder to observe or manage. So look at Exodus chapter 27 or 20, verse 17. This is the 10th commandment in the 10 commandments. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor, which is not a measurable thing. This is not an external thing. To covet, to envy, to have some sort of wish that I had something that somebody else does and resentment about that, that is all inside. I could be coveting right now and you would have no idea. And so the question becomes, what are we supposed to do with the 10th commandment as it relates to the other 9? And so there have been lots of discussions and arguments and back and forths among like rabbis about what do we do about the 10th commandment. And lots of rabbis have written and come to the conclusion of, no. The 10th commandment is not like an instruction. The 10th commandment is a reward. The 10th commandment is a blessing. The 10th commandment is a way of saying, listen, if you will follow this path, if you will look at these other 9 things and you will begin to travel this path and embrace this kind of story, then you won't covet. You won't wish you had somebody else's life. Your life will make a lot more sense to you if you are already on a journey that is true to the path that you've always been meant to be on. In other words, we tend to read this as you shall not covet. But the rabbis would say, maybe we should read it as like, hey, if you will follow your own path, you shall not covet. You don't have to live like this. You don't have to be consumed with, yeah, but what about that guy? It's this ancient invitation to say, your path is a gift. The journey that you're on is unlike anybody else's. And so if you spend all your time asking, yeah, but what about that guy? You're going to miss the beautiful gift that is your own journey. And Jesus is saying, you don't have to live like this. The writer of Exodus is saying, you don't have to live like this. You don't have to live your whole life consumed by the way other people, like the things that other people are or are not receiving. So we've each been given a unique path, and resentment and envy will kill all of our joy and destroy our souls. This will suck the life out of everything that we could possibly enjoy, because all we're doing is wishing we had somebody else's experiences. I don't know about you. I know we have lots of parents in the room. We have 3 kids, and they're all different ages, genders, temperaments, like very different people. And so we have, so among those 3 kids, we have had to sort of come to a point of, or like their entire lives, really, we've had to sort of wrestle and kind of fight against the impulse to say things like, that's not fair. Like if one of them gets to do something that the other 2 didn't get to do, that there's almost like now the other 2 are owed something, you know what I mean? To which it's like, yeah, but okay. I feel like a lot of times if one of our kids leaves the house to go do something fun, they expect all the rest of us to sit in chairs quietly and stare at the wall until they get back and do nothing that the others might enjoy. Like, if one of them like gets to go on a sleepover and then comes home and finds out we had pizza while they were at the sleepover, they're mad that we had pizza without them. We're like, oh, okay, listen, we are not going to like lay on gravel and pretend like we hate our lives until you get home. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to go ahead and live our lives. But again, it's not you don't want fair. You just want to make sure you don't miss anything that everybody else gets to do every once in a while, you know? And so like, yeah, they have different temperaments, different ages, different levels of being responsible for things. And so, yes, sometimes one of them might get to do something that the other 2 wish they could get to do. And if the other 2 spend their whole time being mad that they didn't get to do that too, like nobody gets to have any fun at all. There is no joy in those experiences. So what we're trying to sort of like build into the system is like, yeah, sometimes you get to do things that the other 2 didn't get invited to do, and that's going to be okay, because sometimes the other ones get to do stuff. That's just how it goes. That's life. And it's not just like suck it up, because it's like not like don't tell me it's not fair or anything like that. It is like, no, we are learning that everybody's life, everybody's journey, everybody's experiences aren't going to all look the same. And so we're all invited to just look at what we do have and where we are and say, okay, where am I on my own journey? What am I doing to experience my own story? So yeah, sometimes people will get advantages or privileges or opportunities that I didn't get. And sometimes that can be really hard to swallow. Sometimes that can be really frustrating. And it's easy to see other people have things easier than you and to get resentful and angry about that. And that's understandable sometimes, because it just seems like I'm working so hard, I'm doing everything right, how come they got ahead of me? And it's really easy and understandable in a lot of cases to feel that way. But also in those moments, I think Jesus is saying like, yeah, but your job is to follow your path. And sometimes your path won't look like you expect it to, or like or like other people's paths do. They're going to have their own struggles. They're going to have their own moments of pain and crisis. You don't want that either. Like, so everybody's on their own path. Everybody's trying their best to sort of live into the life that they've been given. And Jesus is saying, yeah, don't spend all your time wishing you had somebody else's situation, because that's not going to get you anywhere. Your job is to travel your path. Nobody can live your path but you. So may you find yourself at home in your own life. May you find that you can be at peace with your journey, with your path. May we resist the urge to look around and say, yeah, but what about them? May we instead hear Jesus say, what is that to you? You follow me. You go on the journey that I've set out for you, and you're going to be okay.